The city had always thrived on shadows, quiet deals in dimly lit rooms, whispers passed across card tables, fortunes made and destroyed in the space of a single signature. Among these shadows, one figure had learned to dance better than most: Victor Kane. For decades, he had been a name known only in hushed tones, a con artist so masterful that even those who discovered they'd been tricked often walked away marveling at the elegance of the swindle. He was the kind of man who left no fingerprints, no trace, just the faint taste of humiliation in the mouths of the rich and greedy he so often targeted. But age had a way of dulling even the sharpest blades. By his early 60s, Victor's reputation had caught up to him. The circle of people who wanted him ruined, imprisoned, or worse had grown too large to ignore. It was no longer just casino owners or defrauded investors. It was crime lords, politicians, and a host of dangerous men who hated being made fools of. Victor had spent his life thriving on the edge of risk, but now he was cornered. He knew he had only one move left in him, and it would have to be his masterpiece. The plan had been simmering in his mind for years, an elaborate web woven tighter with every betrayal he had suffered. There was Marcus Doyle, once Victor's apprentice, who had stolen from him and sold his secrets. There was Alistair Venn, a corrupt tycoon whose money had bought off judges and police alike, leaving Victor with nowhere to turn. And there were countless others, men who had used Victor when it suited them and tried to erase him when it didn't. If Victor was going down, he decided he would take them with him. He began quietly, reaching out through old channels. A message here, a whisper there, false leads planted like breadcrumbs. He let rumors circulate that he had one final con prepared, something so large, so devastating, that it would shift fortunes overnight. His enemies, greedy as ever, couldn't resist circling like vultures. Victor made sure they all believed they had an inside line to his plan. He played them against each other, feeding Marcus one half-truth, dangling a forged document in front of Alistair, and sending anonymous tips to rival factions. Each piece of information looked like a prize, but together they were a fuse, burning toward an inevitable explosion. Victor's final stage was theatrical in its cruelty. He arranged a gathering at an abandoned opera house, a relic of the city's gilded past. Invitations were sent through proxies, carefully designed to make each man believe he was coming to seize the con artist's empire once and for all. The opera house, with its crumbling balconies and dust-thick air, became the stage for his last performance. They arrived one by one, suspicious, armed, their eyes darting across the empty velvet seats. Each believed they were a step ahead, that they had finally cornered Victor Kane. But when the old man emerged from the shadows of the stage, dressed in a simple black suit, he wasn't holding a deal in his hands. He was holding truth. Hidden in the rafters, cameras streamed the gathering live to every major news outlet, every law enforcement office, every courtroom archive Victor had secretly fed with evidence for months. He had spent years compiling documents, recordings, and accounts of every man's crimes, the embezzlement, the bribes, the murders concealed beneath layers of corruption. What they thought was bait was, in fact, their undoing. The men shouted, threatened, even pulled their weapons, but by then it was far too late. Victor's voice, calm and steady, echoed through the opera house as he narrated their sins for the world to hear. His enemies, the men who had once thought themselves untouchable, found themselves exposed, cornered by a man they had dismissed as an old relic. And then, with the police sirens already growing nearer, Victor disappeared. Some swore they saw him slip through a hidden passage backstage. Others believed he never left the stage at all. The truth was never confirmed. By the time the authorities stormed the opera house, Victor Kane was gone, leaving only the stunned and enraged faces of the city's most powerful criminals captured forever on film. In the weeks that followed, empires collapsed. Marcus Doyle was extradited on charges of international fraud. Alistair Venn's businesses were seized, his offshore accounts frozen. Politicians fell, judges resigned, and the city was thrown into chaos. Victor had dismantled his enemies not with bullets or threats, but with the one thing they could never shield themselves from: exposure. And yet, Victor himself was never found. Some whispered he had died that night, slipping quietly into the darkness after the curtain fell on his greatest act. Others claimed to have seen him in foreign cities, always alone, always watching. Whatever the truth, his legend only grew. The world remembered him not merely as a thief or a trickster, but as an architect of downfall, a man who gave revenge the elegance of a stage play. His final act was not about money or power. It was about control, about writing the last chapter of his story on his own terms. The ultimate takedown had not been his enemy's victory, but his. And in the end, the con artist had delivered his masterpiece, the perfect revenge. Victor's disappearance became the greatest trick of his career. In the aftermath, newspapers ran headlines with his name for weeks, documentaries rushed into production, and every two-bit hustler in the city tried to claim they'd once crossed paths with him. The opera house, abandoned for decades, became a shrine of sorts. People would sneak in just to stand on the same stage where the fall of giants had been orchestrated. But while the public devoured the spectacle, those who had truly known Victor understood that his revenge had been far more personal than the world realized. Beneath the layers of deception and strategy, there had been a lifetime of betrayal that shaped his final masterpiece. Years earlier, Victor had been betrayed not only by partners and apprentices, but by the woman he loved. Evelyn Cross, a fellow con artist, had been his equal in every sense, sharp, daring, capable of smiling while slipping a wallet from a man's pocket. Together, they had built scams so intricate they resembled art. But Evelyn, like everyone in Victor's life, had a price. When Marcus Doyle offered her power and wealth, she took it, selling Victor's secrets for her own survival. It was Evelyn's betrayal that had left him broken, hunted, and nearly forgotten. In the opera house's unveiling, Victor had not only destroyed the men who stole from him, but had carefully placed Evelyn in the spotlight too. A hidden file, dropped to the authorities at the exact moment, exposed her crimes across 3 continents. She was dragged from her luxury estate in handcuffs the very night Victor vanished. For him, it was not enough to ruin empires. He had to make sure the ghosts of his past suffered the weight of their own treachery. Still, his revenge was not entirely cruel. Not everyone who had crossed paths with Victor was left in ruins. An old friend, Thomas Green, a retired grifter who had walked away from the life, found himself the unexpected recipient of a fortune. Victor had funneled money into Green's failing business years before, but in his last act, he transferred hidden accounts, enough for Thomas and his family to live out their lives free from the shadow of crime. To Victor, loyalty deserved reward, just as betrayal demanded punishment. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies scrambled to piece together how Victor had managed to orchestrate such a spectacle without leaving a trace. They tore apart safe houses, interrogated contacts, and tracked rumors of him from Lisbon to Buenos Aires, but Victor Kane was like smoke, present, felt, but impossible to hold. Some believed he had vanished into the criminal underworld, protected by those who admired his artistry. Others swore he had retired quietly in some nameless coastal village, spending his days drinking wine and watching the ocean. And yet, there were whispers. A casino in Monaco claimed they saw him months later, older, thinner, sitting at a roulette table but never placing a bet. A banker in Dubai swore a client with Victor's voice had withdrawn a fortune using forged documents, so flawless they were almost legal. No sighting was ever confirmed, but the legend persisted. Victor Kane, the man who had turned revenge into performance art, was still out there, watching. What made his story so enduring wasn't just the spectacle of the opera house, nor the public downfall of his enemies, but the precision of it all. Every move had been calculated, every detail rehearsed, as if Victor had spent his entire life preparing for that single night. To those who studied him, it was as though his entire career had been a prologue to that final act, a grand crescendo of deceit and vengeance. In the city, the fallout continued for years. Power vacuums created chaos. Old alliances shattered, new syndicates rose, and the once untouchable elite found themselves looking over their shoulders. Victor hadn't just destroyed individuals, he had disrupted an entire system. And in that chaos, there was a kind of freedom. For the first time in decades, the city belonged not to the corrupt and the greedy, but to those bold enough to seize it. Yet, even as his enemies rotted in prison cells or fled into exile, Victor Kane's absence loomed larger than his presence ever had. He had become less of a man and more of a myth, a reminder to all who thrived in the shadows that betrayal carried a cost. His revenge was not only about justice, not even about balance, it was about legacy. And perhaps, somewhere, behind a glass of wine in a quiet cafe, an old man with sharp eyes and a faint smile sat listening to the whispers of his own legend, content to let the world wonder. Because for Victor Kane, the greatest con of all was not the money he stole or the lives he destroyed. It was convincing the world that he was gone, when in truth, the final curtain had never truly fallen. The legend of Victor Kane refused to die. In fact, it grew heavier with each passing year, retold in whispers in prison yards, in cigar smoke-filled bars, and in corporate boardrooms where men in suits swore they'd never be caught the way Alistair Van had. For some, he became a cautionary tale, for others, a folk hero. But beneath the myth, there were truths that few ever uncovered. Victor had not always been the cold-blooded tactician who engineered the opera house spectacle. Once, long ago, he had been a boy who believed in fairness. Raised in the narrow back alleys of a city that chewed up the weak, Victor learned early that honesty didn't buy food and integrity didn't pay rent. His father had been a gambler who lost more than he ever won, his mother a seamstress who died before Victor turned 12. By 16, he was running scams in card halls, not out of greed, but survival. The first time he tricked a man out of money, he hadn't felt pride. He had felt relief. Relief that he could eat that night. Relief that, for once, he wasn't the one being played. From there, it was inevitable. Victor became addicted not to wealth, but to control. To the thrill of outsmarting men who thought themselves untouchable. Every con was a small rebellion against a world built on lies. He didn't steal from the poor. He didn't swindle those who couldn't afford to lose. His prey was always the arrogant, the greedy, the ones who had made fortunes crushing others. In Victor's eyes, he wasn't a criminal. He was balancing the scales in ways the law never would. But even balancing the scales came with a price. The betrayals piled up like bodies. Marcus Doyle's treachery had cut the deepest, for Victor had treated the young man like a son. He taught him everything: how to read a man's eyes at the poker table, how to forge documents so authentic they fooled banks, how to vanish in a crowd without leaving a shadow. And Marcus had repaid him by selling him out to Evelyn Cross. That betrayal had almost killed Victor. It was in that near-death moment that the seed of his ultimate revenge had been planted. For Victor, the opera house takedown wasn't only about exposing corruption, it was about redemption. Redemption for the years of lies, for every betrayal that had carved scars into him, for the belief that even a man like him could write his own ending. In the years leading up to his grand finale, Victor lived like a ghost. He rented apartments under false names, sometimes disappearing for months into the countryside. He studied his enemies, gathering evidence, piecing together the threads of their corruption until his walls were lined with notes, photographs, and diagrams. It looked less like a con, and more like a war plan. He stopped chasing money. Every dollar he acquired went into the machinery of his revenge. When the night at the opera house arrived, it wasn't a gamble, it was inevitability. And yet, the mystery of Victor's fate gnawed at the city. Some believed he had staged his own death, collapsing backstage from exhaustion, leaving only ashes and smoke behind. Others insisted he was alive, operating in the shadows, perhaps even pulling strings in the chaos he had left. What few knew was that Victor had prepared for both outcomes. In one scenario, he would die that night, remembered forever as the man who toppled titans. In another, he would vanish, carrying only enough wealth to live quietly in the margins of the world. Both endings were written, both rehearsed. His enemies were not the only ones he had outplayed. He had outplayed fate itself. Decades later, long after the opera house had been renovated into a museum, there were still rumors. A handwritten note slipped anonymously into a reporter's desk drawer. A forged passport bearing a photograph of an older man with sharp, knowing eyes. A mysterious benefactor funding scholarships for street kids, always under the alias K. Each clue felt deliberate, as though Victor was still out there, reminding the world he had never truly lost control. His story had become more than fact or fiction. It had become myth. The ultimate revenge takedown was not just about exposing corruption or punishing betrayal. It was about ensuring that Victor Kane, the boy who once starved in the alleys, the man who once trusted too easily, would be remembered forever, not as a victim of betrayal, but as the master of his own ending. And so, in the quiet corners of the world, whenever a deal went sour, whenever a con collapsed with poetic precision, someone would whisper his name. Victor Kane, the man who turned revenge into an art form, the con artist who refused to vanish, the final act that never truly ended.